The red earth stretched endlessly beneath a sky that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of clouds. In the heart of South Australia's vast outback, where the horizon shimmered like a mirage and the silence was broken only by the occasional cry of a wedge-tailed eagle, stood the town of Willowbrook. It was the sort of place that appeared on maps only as a small dot, easily missed by those traveling the dusty highway that connected Adelaide to the mining settlements further north. Willowbrook had seen better days. The discovery of copper deposits in the 1890s had brought prosperity and hope, but the veins had run thin, and now only stubborn souls remained. The weathered buildings lined Main Street like old friends who had decided to grow old together. The post office with its peeling paint, Henderson's general store with its creaking wooden floors, and the pub where miners still gathered to nurse their amber consolations. But at the heart of this forgotten town stood something remarkable: Joanna's Table, a restaurant that had earned a reputation far beyond the dusty roads that led to it. The building itself was modest. Red brick walls that had absorbed decades of desert sun, wide verandas that offered blessed shade, and windows that caught the morning light like welcoming eyes. Yet inside, magic happened daily. Joanna Mallory moved through a kitchen with the practiced grace of a woman who had found her calling. At 48, she possessed a kind of beauty that comes not from youth but from purpose. Her hands, weathered by years of hard work, could transform simple ingredients into meals that spoke to the soul. Her dark hair, now streaked with silver, was always pulled back in a practical bun, but rebellious strands would escape to frame her face as she worked over the large cast-iron stove that dominated her kitchen. This morning, like every morning for the past 15 years, Joanna rose before dawn. She had learned long ago that success came to those who greeted the day before it was fully awake. As she kneaded dough for her famous bread rolls, her mind wandered to the preparations needed for today's lunch service. She had received word that the usual Tuesday crowd would be joined by some special visitors, politicians from Adelaide, making their way through the district on what the newspapers called a listening tour. The irony was not lost on her. Politicians listening. Now there was a contradiction if she had ever heard one. Morning, Joanna called a voice from the dining room. Betty Cartwright, her only full-time employee, was already arranging fresh wildflowers in mason jars, transforming simple tables into invitations to linger. Morning, Betty, any word on how many we are expecting for this political circus? Betty chuckled, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Mrs. Henderson says the governor himself might grace us with his presence. Michael Redford, making his grand tour before the election. Joanna's hand stilled on the dough. Michael Redford. She knew that name, knew it well. 4 years ago, he had campaigned through these very streets, promising infrastructure improvements, better roads, support for rural communities. The people of Willowbrook had believed him, had voted for him with hope in their hearts. The better roads never came. The promised telephone lines remained a distant dream. The small hospital he had pledged to build existed only in the faded campaign posters that still clung to fence posts around town. Well, Joanna said, resuming her kneading with perhaps more force than necessary, I suppose his money is as good as anyone else's. Though I hope he doesn't expect special treatment just because he wears fancy suits and makes pretty speeches. Outside, the town was already buzzing with an energy it hadn't felt in months. Shop owners swept their front steps with unusual vigor, and someone had even bothered to water the struggling geraniums in the planters along Main Street. Children pressed their faces against school windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the motorcade that would bring the governor and his entourage to their little corner of the world. As the sun climbed higher, painting the red earth in shades of gold and amber, the excitement became palpable. Willowbrook was about to receive attention from the outside world, and for a town that often felt forgotten, this was no small thing. Joanna, however, remained focused on her work. She seasoned the lamb stew that had become her signature dish, the recipe passed down from her grandmother and refined through years of practice. The secret, she had discovered, was not just in the spices, though the blend of rosemary, thyme, and a hint of native pepperberry certainly helped, but in the time and attention she gave to each ingredient. Love, her grandmother had always said, was the most important seasoning of all. The irony of preparing a meal with love for a man she had already decided to dislike was not lost on her, but Joanna had never been one to compromise her standards, regardless of the customer. As the clock tower chimed 11, marking the approach of the lunch hour, the distant rumble of engines announced the arrival of the governor's motorcade. Through the windows of Joanna's table, she could see the townspeople gathering along Main Street, their faces bright with curiosity and hope. Children waved small flags hastily crafted from scraps of fabric, and the mayor, resplendent in his best suit despite the heat, stood ready to deliver the welcoming speech he had been practicing all week. The motorcade was impressive. 3 black automobiles that gleamed despite the dust of the road, their chrome bumpers reflecting the harsh Australian sun. The lead car bore the official seal of South Australia, and as it came to a stop in front of the town hall, a small cheer rose from the gathered crowd. From the second car emerged a tall figure that commanded immediate attention. Governor Michael Redford stepped onto the red earth of Main Street with the confidence of a man accustomed to being watched. At 52, he possessed a kind of distinguished appearance that photographers loved. Silver hair that caught the light just so, a strong jawline that spoke of determination, and eyes the color of the ocean on a stormy day. His suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and when he smiled at the crowd, it was with the practiced warmth of a man who had made a career of winning hearts. But as Joanna watched from a kitchen window, she noticed something else. A weariness around his eyes, a slight hesitation in his gestures that suggested the smile might not reach all the way to his heart. For just a moment, as he shook hands with the mayor and accepted the bouquet of wildflowers from a shy schoolgirl, Michael Redford looked like a man playing a role he had grown tired of performing. The crowd began to disperse as the governor's advance team guided him toward the arrangements made for his visit. A formal luncheon had been planned at the town hall, complete with the best china the ladies' auxiliary could muster and speeches from local dignitaries. It would be proper, predictable, and thoroughly political. But as the entourage made its way down Main Street, Michael Redford's attention was caught by something unexpected. The aroma of roasting lamb and baking bread drifted from Joanna's table, carried on the desert breeze like a siren's call. He paused, inhaling deeply, and for the first time that day, his smile seemed genuine. "What's that building there?" he asked his aide, a nervous young man who had been checking his watch every 30 seconds since they arrived. "Oh, that's just a local restaurant, Governor. Nothing fancy. We have your luncheon arranged at." "I can smell fresh bread," Michael interrupted, his voice carrying a note of wonder that surprised even him. "And if I'm not mistaken, that's lamb stew. Real lamb stew, not the watered-down version they serve at political dinners." The aide looked uncomfortable. "So, the arrangements have all been made. The local committee is expecting you, and we are already running behind schedule for the afternoon rally in Broken Hill." But Michael Redford was already walking toward Joanna's table, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the memory of his childhood, when his grandmother would prepare meals that filled not just the stomach but the soul. Perhaps it was a weariness of too many rubber chicken dinners and campaign spreads designed more for photographs than for satisfaction. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that, in a day filled with carefully orchestrated encounters, here was something real. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the conversation in the dining room immediately stilled. Joanna looked up from the plate she was arranging, her hands steady despite the sudden tension that filled the air. For a moment, their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that whatever happened next will be unscripted. "Good afternoon," Michael said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "I don't suppose you have room for one more at lunch." Joanna studied him for a long moment, noting the quality of his clothes, the confidence in his bearing, and yes, the weariness that seemed to cling to him like dust from the road. When she spoke, her voice was clear and unimpressed. "I suppose that depends on whether you're here as the governor of South Australia or simply as a man who's hungry for a good meal." The question hung in the air like the heat shimmer on the horizon, and in that moment, both Joanna Mallory and Michael Redford understood that they were about to embark on a conversation that would change them both. If stories about second chances, mature love, and unexpected turns in the heart of the Outback speak to you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below. Tell us, what would you choose? Power or peace? Chapter 1. A meal worth remembering. The silence that followed Joanna's question stretched between them like the vast spaces of the outback itself. Michael Redford, a man accustomed to having answers prepared for every contingency, found himself genuinely considering the question. When was the last time someone had asked him to choose between his title and his humanity? "I'm here as a man who hasn't had a decent meal in 3 days," he said finally, and the honesty in his voice surprised them both. Joanna nodded once, a sharp movement that suggested approval. "Then you'd better take a seat before the lamb gets cold. Betty, set a place at table 6. Betty Cartwright, who had been watching the exchange with the rapt attention of someone witnessing history in the making, nearly dropped the water pitcher she was holding. "But Mrs. Mallory, shouldn't we? Here's a customer," Joanna interrupted firmly. "And in my restaurant, customers get fed, not fawned over." Michael smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn all day. Table 6 it is. As he made his way to the designated table, Michael became aware of the other diners watching him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. These were working people, their hands bearing the calluses of honest labor, their faces weathered by sun and wind. They had voted for him 4 years ago. He realized, trusted him with their hopes for a better future. The weight of that trust, and his failure to fully honor it, settled on his shoulders like the red dust that coated everything in this harsh and beautiful land. Joanna emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate that made his mouth water just from the sight of it. The lamb stew was rich and dark, vegetables swimming in a gravy that spoke of hours of patient simmering. Beside it sat a portion of damper bread, still warm from the oven, and roasted vegetables that glistened with herbs and careful preparation. "Hey," she said, setting the plate before him with no ceremony. "That should hold you until your next political gathering." The words carried a sting, and Michael looked up to find Joanna's eyes fixed on him with undisguised challenge. "You sound as though you disapprove of political gatherings, Mrs. Mallory, Joanna Mallory. And I don't disapprove of politics, Governor. I disapprove of promises that evaporate like dew in the desert." A few other diners had stopped their conversations to listen, sensing that something significant was unfolding at table 6. Michael took a bite of the lamb stew, and the flavor was so rich, so perfectly balanced, that for a moment he forgot everything else. When he looked up, Joanna was still standing there, waiting. "This is extraordinary," he said sincerely. "I haven't tasted anything this good since I was a boy eating my grandmother's cooking." "Flattery won't improve the roads leading out of this town," Joanna replied, but there was less bite in her voice now. "Or bring us the telephone service you promised, or the improvements to our school that the children are still waiting for." Michael set down his fork, meeting her gaze directly. The other diners were openly listening now, and he could feel the weight of their attention. In his political life, this would be the moment for deflection, for explaining the complexities of governance and budget constraints. Instead, he found himself speaking the simple truth. "You're right," he said quietly. "I made promises I haven't kept. Some because of circumstances beyond my control, others because I allowed other priorities to take precedence." The admission rippled through the room like a stone thrown into still water. Politicians, the people of Willowbrook had learned, did not admit to failures, especially not to a roomful of constituents. Joanna blinked, clearly not having expected such directness. "Well," she said after a moment, "that's more honesty than we had from Adelaide in 4 years." She turned to go, but Michael's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Mallory, would you join me? I'd like to hear more about these promises I failed to keep. I have a kitchen to run, Governor." "Michael," he corrected, "and surely the woman who can create a meal like this can spare a few minutes to educate a politician about the real needs of a community." Joanna hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Betty was managing the lunch service with practiced efficiency. The lunch crowd was winding down, and truth be told, she was curious about this man who seemed so different from the polished figure she had expected. "5 minutes," she said, pulling out the chair across from him. "And I'm not educating you. I'm telling you what you should already know." As she sat down, Michael noticed the way she moved, efficiently, without wasted motion, like someone who had learned to accomplish much with limited resources. Her hands, he observed, were those of someone who worked for a living, yet they possessed an elegance that spoke of natural grace rather than artificial refinement. "Tell me about the roads," he said, cutting another piece of lamb. "The roads are more like suggestions than actual passages," Joanna began, her voice taking on the rhythm of someone who had thought about these problems many times. "When it rains, which isn't often, but when it does, the mail truck can't get through. That means medicine doesn't arrive when Mrs. Peterson has her heart troubles, or when the Williamson baby had that fever last winter." Michael nodded, chewing slowly. The lamb was incredibly tender, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify but that spoke of this land, this place that existed so far from the concerns of Adelaide. "The telephone service," Joanna continued, warming to the subject, "would mean Doc Harrison could consult with specialists in the city instead of having to guess when someone presents with symptoms he's never seen before. It would mean families could stay in touch when sons and daughters leave for work in the mines or the cities. And the school improvements." Joanna's expression softened. "We have 37 children in grades 1 through 8, all in one room with Miss Catherine doing her best with textbooks that were old when I was a student. The roof leaks when it storms, and in summer the children can barely concentrate for the heat." As she spoke, Michael found himself studying her face. There was passion there, yes, but also a deep pragmatism that came from years of making do with less than ideal circumstances. This was not the manufactured concern he was accustomed to hearing from political advisors and community leaders seeking favor. This was genuine care for the people and place she had chosen to call home. "You speak about this town as though it were your own child," he observed. Joanna's eyes flashed. "It is, in a way. I've been here 23 years, since I was 25 and foolish enough to follow a man to the middle of nowhere because I thought love was all we needed." "And was it?" The question was more personal than he had intended, and he saw Joanna's guard go up immediately. But she answered, perhaps because his earlier honesty had earned him the right to ask. "Love was enough while it lasted," she said carefully. "But Tom died in a mining accident when our youngest was barely walking. Turns out love doesn't pay for food or keep the roof from leaking." "I'm sorry," Michael said, and meant it. "Don't be. I learned something valuable, that I was stronger than I thought, and that this place—" She gestured toward the window where the endless red landscape stretched to the horizon. "This place becomes part of you if you let it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared honesty settling between them. Michael finished his lamb and reached for the damper bread, noting how perfectly it complemented the rich stew. "Mrs. Mallory, Joanna, may I ask you something that has nothing to do with politics?" She raised an eyebrow but nodded. "How did you learn to cook like this? This meal is better than anything I've had in the finest restaurants in Adelaide or Melbourne." For the first time since he had entered her restaurant, Joanna smiled, really smiled, and the transformation was remarkable. The stern lines around her eyes softened, and he caught a glimpse of the young woman who had once believed that love was enough. "My grandmother taught me the basics," she said, "but the real secret is caring about the people you're feeding. You can taste indifference in food just as surely as you can taste salt or pepper. And do you care about feeding me?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, more personal than he had intended. Joanna considered this, her head tilted slightly. "I care about feeding anyone who comes to my table honestly hungry. The question is, Governor, Michael, are you honestly hungry, or are you simply gathering material for your next campaign speech about connecting with ordinary Australians?" The directness of the question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was perceptive. How many times had he done exactly that? Collected stories and experiences to deploy strategically in speeches and press conferences. "I think," he said slowly, "that I'm hungrier than I realized, and not just for food." Something shifted in Joanna's expression, a recognition of vulnerability that she hadn't expected from a man in his position. Before she could respond, however, the bell above the door chimed urgently, and Michael's aide appeared, looking harried and apologetic. "Governor, so we really must go. The town council is waiting, and we are already 40 minutes behind schedule for Broken Hill. Michael looked at his empty plate, then at Joanna, who was already rising from a chair with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to interruptions. "Of course," he said, reaching for his wallet. "What do I owe you for the meal?" 3 shillings and 6pence, Joanna said matter-of-factly. He left a pound note on the table, more than 3 times the cost of the meal. "Thank you," he said, standing and putting on his hat. That was the most honest conversation I've had in years. As he moved toward the door, Joanna called after him, "Governor." He turned, hope flickering in his storm-gray eyes. "If you ever back this way and you're honestly hungry again," she said, "there's always room at table 6. Michael Redford walked back into the blazing afternoon sun, but the warmth he carried with him came from more than just the desert heat. Behind him, Joanna Mallory began clearing the table, but her movements were slower than usual, more thoughtful, as if she were processing something unexpected. Betty Cartwright watched from behind the counter, her romantic heart already spinning stories about the electricity she had witnessed between the widow and the governor. But Joanna simply stacked the dishes and returned to her kitchen, where there were vegetables to prepare for dinner and bread to bake for tomorrow. Still, as she worked, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done in longer than she could remember. Chapter 2, The Man Behind the Office. The red earth was still cool beneath the morning stars when Joanna rose the next day, but already she could sense the promise of heat in the air. The Outback mornings were deceptive that way, gentle and forgiving until the sun climbed high enough to remind everyone who was truly in charge of this ancient land. She moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, starting the coffee that would fuel her through the breakfast preparations, checking the sourdough starter that had been a constant companion for 15 years, and reviewing the mental list of tasks that would carry her through another day at Joanna's table. The governor's motorcade had departed the previous afternoon amid much fanfare, speeches, and promises to consider the town's needs. Joanna had watched from a kitchen window as the 3 black automobiles disappeared into the heat shimmer, carrying Michael Redford back to his world of politics and compromise. She had felt a surprising pang of, what? Disappointment? Regret? She pushed the feeling aside and focused on the evening service, which had been busier than usual as townspeople came to his second-hand accounts of the governor's unexpected lunch choice. Now, as she kneaded dough for the morning's biscuits, she found her thoughts returning unbidden to the conversation at table 6. There had been something in Michael Redford's eyes, a weariness that spoke of more than just political fatigue. She recognized it because she had seen it in her own mirror during those first years after Tom's death. The look of someone who had been strong for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to simply be themselves. The bell above the door chimed, interrupting her reverie. Joanna glanced at the clock, barely 6:30. Far too early for the breakfast crowd. "We are not open yet," she called out, not looking up from her work. "I was hoping you might make an exception." The voice made her hand still on the dough. She looked up to see Michael Redford standing in the doorway, but this was not the polished politician from yesterday. His usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, his suit wrinkled from travel, and there was something almost hesitant in his posture. "Governor," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "aren't you supposed to be in Broken Hill by now?" "I was," he said, stepping fully into the restaurant and closing the door behind him. "I gave my speech, shook the appropriate hands, made the necessary promises. But then I found myself driving back here instead of continuing to Port Augusta." Joanna studied his face, noting the shadows under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "That seems like poor campaign strategy." "Probably," he agreed with a rueful smile. "My staff thinks I've lost my mind. They are frantically rearranging the schedule as we speak." "And have you? Lost your mind? I mean..." Michael considered the question seriously. "I'm beginning to think that losing my mind might be the most sensible thing I've done in years." Despite herself, Joanna felt her lips twitch with amusement. "Well, a man who's lost his mind probably needs a good breakfast. Coffee's fresh, and I was just about to start the eggs." As she moved to pour him a cup of coffee, Michael took the same seat he had occupied yesterday. The early morning light streaming through the windows was different from the harsh brightness of midday. softer, more forgiving, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "Why did you come back?" Joanna asked, setting the coffee before him. "Because yesterday was the first time in months, maybe years, that someone spoke to me as though I was simply a man rather than a political office," he said without hesitation. "Do you know how rare that is in my world?" Joanna cracked eggs into a pan, the sizzle filling the comfortable silence. "I imagine it must be lonely, being surrounded by people who are always thinking about what they can get from you." "It is," Michael said quietly, "more lonely than I expected when I first ran for office." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "What made you want to be governor in the first place?" "The same thing that makes you care about the roads and the telephone service. I think. I wanted to make things better. I had ideas about progress, about bringing South Australia into the modern age while preserving what makes us unique. And now," Michael stayed into his coffee as though it might hold answers. "Now I spend most of my time in meetings about meetings, arguing with bureaucrats about budget allocations and political advisors about poll numbers. I'm not sure when I stopped being a public servant and became a political commodity." Joanna plated the eggs, perfectly cooked, the yolks golden and runny, alongside thick slices of bacon and buttered toast made from bread she had baked yesterday. She set the plate before him and poured herself a cup of coffee, settling into the chair across from him. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when Tom died, everyone in town had advice for me. Sell the restaurant, move back to Adelaide where my sister lived, find another husband to take care of me. Everyone was so sure they knew what was best for my life. But you stayed?" "I stayed because this place had become part of me, and I had become part of it. The idea of leaving felt like cutting off a limb." She sipped her coffee, studying his face. "Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing the difference between what others expect of you and what you actually need." Michael took a bite of eggs, savoring the simple perfection of a meal prepared with care. "And what do you need, Joanna?" The use of her first name created an intimacy that surprised them both. She had not invited it, but somehow it felt natural coming from him. "Peace," she said without hesitation. "The right to wake up each morning and choose my own purpose for the day. The satisfaction of feeding people well. The freedom to speak my mind without calculating the political cost." "That sounds like paradise." "It sounds like what you've given up," she observed gently. They ate in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the red earth beyond the windows in deeper shades of gold and crimson. Other early risers were beginning to stir. Joanna could see old Mr. Henderson opening his store across the street, and Doc Harrison's Model T putted past on his way to make house calls. "Tell me about your children," Michael said suddenly. Joanna's face softened with maternal pride. "Sarah is 26 now, married to a good man who manages a cattle station up north. They have 2 little ones I don't see nearly often enough. And David is 24, working for the railroad in Adelaide. He writes letters full of big dreams and bigger plans." "You raise them alone." "I raised them with help," she corrected. "This town may be small, but people look after each other. Mrs. Peterson taught Sarah to play piano, and Doc Harrison made sure David understood that being fatherless didn't make him less of a man. Do you ever regret not remarrying? Not giving them a father figure?" The question was deeply personal, but something in his tone suggested it wasn't idle curiosity. Joanna considered her answer carefully. "I had offers," she said finally. "Good men, some of them. But I learned something important after Tom died, that I could be complete on my own. Marriage should add to your life, not complete it. Too many women marry because they are afraid of being alone, and too many men marry because they need someone to take care of them. And if someone came along who added to your life without trying to complete it." Joanna met his gaze directly. "Then I suppose I'd have to decide whether what they were adding was worth what I might have to give up." The weight of the conversation settled between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Michael pushed back on the table, reaching for his wallet. "What do I owe you for breakfast?" 2 shillings, Joanna said, standing to clear his plate. Again, he left more than the meal cost, but this time Joanna didn't comment on his generosity. Instead, She walked him to the door, very aware of his presence beside her. "Joanna," he said as he reached for the door handle, "if I asked you a hypothetical question, would you give me an honest answer? I don't know any other kind to give. If circumstances were different, if I weren't who I am, if you weren't who you are, do you think we might have found something worth exploring?" The question hung in the morning air like the scent of eucalyptus after rain. Joanna felt her heart do something complicated in her chest, a flutter that reminded her she was still, despite everything, a woman capable of feeling more than maternal pride and entrepreneurial satisfaction. "Governor," she said softly, "I think the fact that you are who you are, and I am who I am, is exactly what makes any possibility between us both precious and impossible." He nodded slowly, understanding more than she had said. "Will I see you again?" "That depends," Joanna replied, "on whether you're passing through as a politician or returning as a man who's honestly hungry." Michael Redford stepped out into the growing heat of the morning, but he carried with him the memory of golden light and honest conversation. Behind him, Joanna Mallory began preparing for the day's business, but her movements were distracted, her thoughts full of storm-grey eyes and questions that had no easy answers. By the time Betty Cartwright arrived for the morning shift, Joanna had made a decision. Whatever was happening between her and the governor of South Australia, it would not be allowed to disrupt the peace she had worked so hard to build. She was 48 years old, a woman who had learned to be content with her own company and proud of her own accomplishments. But as she went about her morning tasks, she found herself humming again, and the tune was one she had not thought of in 20 years. A love song Tom used to sing to her when they were young and believed that feeling was enough to conquer any obstacle. The irony was not lost on her, even as she hummed. Chapter 3. One last question. The afternoon heat had reached its peak when the sound of automobile engines once again disturbed the peaceful rhythm of Willowbrook's main street. But this time, there was no fanfare, no gathering crowd of curious townspeople. This time, Michael Redford had returned unannounced, his motorcade reduced to a single vehicle that bore none of the official seals or ceremonial flags of his office. Joanna first became aware of his presence when Betty burst through the kitchen doors, her eyes wide with excitement and something that might have been concern. "He's back," Betty announced breathlessly. "The governor is standing in the town square, and people are starting to gather." Through the front windows of the restaurant, Joanna could see the crowd beginning to form. Not the organized reception of 2 days ago, but the organic clustering of people drawn by curiosity and the instinctive understanding that something significant was about to happen. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped outside, joining the townspeople who had emerged from shops and houses to see what had brought their governor back to their forgotten corner of the world. Michael Redford stood in the center of the square, but this was not the polished politician who had arrived with speeches and schedules. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled up against the heat, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the practiced cadence of a campaign address. "I know this is unexpected," he began, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. "I was supposed to be in Port Augusta by now, then Adelaide, then a dozen other towns where I would give the same speech about progress and prosperity that I've given 100 times before." The crowd was growing, drawn by the unusual sight of their governor speaking without notes, without the careful staging that usually accompanied political events. "But something happened here that made me realize I've been giving the wrong speech," Michael continued. "I've been talking about what I think you need instead of listening to what you actually need. I've been so focused on the big picture, the grand plans and sweeping policies, that I've forgotten about the details that make the difference between a community that survives and one that thrives." Joanna found herself moving closer, drawn despite herself by the sincerity in his voice. 2 days ago, a woman in this town told me some hard truths about promises I've made and failed to keep. She reminded me that governance isn't about grand gestures. It's about making sure the mail truck can get through when it rains, and that children have textbooks that weren't old when their parents were students. Several heads turned toward Joanna, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "She reminded me," Michael went on, his eyes now fixed directly on her, "that the measure of a leader isn't in the size of his vision, but in his willingness to see the world through the eyes of those he serves." The crowd was completely silent now, caught up in something they sensed was more than political theater. I've learned something else in the past 2 days, Michael said, his voice growing quieter, more personal. I've learned that there are people in this world who possess a kind of courage I had forgotten existed. The courage to speak truth regardless of consequences. The courage to build something meaningful with their own hands. The courage to remain authentic in a world that constantly tries to remake us in its own image. He paused, his gaze never leaving Joanna's face. This town has taught me about integrity, he concluded, about the difference between serving others and serving yourself. I came here to ask for your votes, but I'm leaving with something more valuable, a reminder of who I wanted to be when I first entered public service. The applause that followed was not the polite, expected clapping of a political gathering, but the genuine appreciation of people who recognized they had witnessed something rare, a politician speaking from the heart rather than from a script. As the crowd began to disperse, their conversations animated by what they had just heard, Michael made his way through the lingering townspeople, accepting their handshakes and comments with the same authentic attention he had shown in his speech. But his destination was clear. He was walking directly toward Joanna. That was quite a speech, she said when he reached her, her voice carefully neutral despite the rapid beating of her heart. It wasn't a speech, Michael replied. It was a confession. Before Joanna could respond, Mayor Williams approached, beaming with the satisfaction of a man whose town had just received unexpected recognition. Governor, that was magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. We should celebrate. Perhaps dinner at the town hall, or... Thank you, Mayor Williams. Michael interrupted gently, but I'm afraid I have other plans for this evening. The mayor's face fell slightly, but he recovered quickly, pumping Michael's hand with enthusiasm before retreating to share the exciting news with his wife. Other plans? Joanna asked, raising an eyebrow. I was hoping, Michael said, that you might allow me to cook dinner for you. The suggestion was so unexpected that Joanna laughed, a genuine sound of surprise and amusement. You want to cook for me? In my own kitchen. I want to do something for you that isn't about taking, Michael said seriously. Everything in my world involves people giving me something. Their time, their votes, their support. I can't remember the last time I was able to simply give without expecting anything in return. Joanna studied his face, searching for hidden motives or political calculations. She found none, only a man who seemed as surprised by his own request as she was by hearing it. Can you actually cook? She asked. I can manage a decent roast and vegetables, Michael admitted with a self-deprecating smile. My grandmother insisted I learn before she'd let me leave for university. She said a man who couldn't feed himself was at the mercy of every woman he met. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She would have liked you, I think. The comment carried an intimacy that made Joanna's breath catch slightly. This was dangerous territory, the kind of personal connection that could complicate everything she had worked to simplify in her life. All right, she heard herself saying, but I choose a menu, and you follow my instructions exactly. I won't have my kitchen reputation ruined by a politician who thinks he knows better than the cook. Michael's smile was radiant. I wouldn't dream of arguing with the chef. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that only the Outback could produce, Joanna found herself in the strange position of being a guest in her own kitchen. She had sent Betty home early with instructions to tell anyone who asked that the restaurant was closed for a private function, which was true enough, even if the private function consisted of watching the governor of South Australia attempt to properly season a leg of lamb. Not so much salt, Joanna advised, standing close enough to guide his hands as he worked. The meat will tell you what it needs if you pay attention. Michael paused in his seasoning, very aware of her proximity. And how exactly does meat communicate its preferences? Through scent, texture, the way it responds to heat. Joanna explained, her voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher. Cooking is about relationships, between ingredients, between flavors, between the cook and the food. You can't force it, you have to listen. I'm beginning to think, Michael said quietly, that cooking has a great deal in common with life. Their eyes met, and for a moment the kitchen seemed to contract around them, the rest of the world fading until there was nothing but the scent of herbs and the electric awareness of two people who had found themselves in uncharted territory. "The vegetables needed tending," Joanna said softly, but neither of them moved. "Joanna," Michael began, his voice rough with something that might have been longing. The spell was broken by the timer on the stove, its sharp ring pulling them back to the practical matter of preparing dinner. Joanna stepped away, busying herself with setting the table, while Michael tended to the roasting vegetables with newfound concentration. They worked in companionable silence, moving around each other with surprising ease. Michael proved to be a capable assistant, following instructions with the attention to detail that had probably served him well in politics. When Joanna reached for a serving dish, he was already holding it. When he needed a spoon, she had anticipated the need and placed one within reach. "You are better at this than I expected," Joanna admitted as they carried the finished meal to the dining room. "I had a good teacher," Michael replied. "An excellent motivation." They ate by candlelight. The formal dining room of Joanna's table transformed into something intimate and personal. The lamb was perfectly cooked, the vegetables seasoned with exactly the right balance of herbs and spices. More importantly, the conversation flowed with the ease of old friends, touching on everything from childhood memories to dreams they had thought forgotten. "Tell me about your grandmother," Joanna said as Michael served the pudding he had somehow managed to prepare alongside the main course. "She raised me after my parents died in an influenza outbreak," Michael began, his voice soft with memory. "She was barely 5 feet tall, but she commanded respect from everyone who met her. She used to say that character wasn't about what you did when people were watching. It was about who you chose to be when no one would ever know the difference. She sounds formidable." She was, but also kind in her way. "She never let me feel sorry for myself, but she never let me doubt that I was loved." Michael paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "I think she would have been disappointed in some of the choices I've made in recent years." "What kind of choices?" Michael set down his fork, considering how much truth he was willing to share. "Compromises that seemed necessary at the time but that changed me in ways I didn't anticipate. Supporting legislation I didn't believe in because it was politically expedient. Staying silent when I should have spoken up because it might have cost me votes. And now I'm wondering if it's possible to find my way back to the man she raised, or if I've traveled too far down the wrong road." Joanna reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. The gesture was spontaneous, born of genuine compassion rather than romantic impulse, but the warmth of her touch sent electricity up his arm. "It's never too late to choose a different direction," she said gently, "but you have to be willing to accept that the new road might be harder than the one you're leaving." They finished their meal in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts too complex for easy expression. When the last dish was cleared and the candles had burned low, they found themselves standing in the quiet restaurant, the weight of the evening settling around them like a comfortable blanket. "I should go," Michael said, but he made no move toward the door. "Yes." Joanna agreed, but she didn't step away from where she stood beside him. "Joanna," he said, turning to face her fully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that I'll accept whatever answer you give without argument or attempt at persuasion." Something in his tone made her heart begin to race. "All right." Michael took her hands in his thumb tracing gentle circles on her knuckles. "Come with me to Adelaide, not as a quiet presence by my side, but as an equal in every sense. Help me remember who I wanted to be when I was young enough to believe that integrity and ambition could coexist." The words hung between them like a bridge that could either connect their two worlds or collapse under the weight of impossibility. Joanna felt her breath catch, not because she hadn't sensed this moment coming, but because the reality of it was so much more overwhelming than her imagination had prepared her for. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I know it sounds impossible." He rushed on, as if speaking quickly could somehow make the obstacles disappear. "I know I'm asking you to give up everything you built here, everything that makes you who you are. But I hope, that together we might create something neither of us could achieve alone." Joanna closed her eyes, feeling the pull of two different futures. In one, she saw herself in Adelaide, dressed in elegant gowns, hosting political dinners and charity events, supporting a man she was rapidly coming to care for as he tried to reclaim his authentic self. It would be a life of influence and importance, of comfortable luxury and social position. In the other, she saw herself here in Willowbrook, rising before dawn to knead bread and prepare meals for people who had become her extended family. She saw quiet mornings with nothing but the desert wind for company, and evenings when her greatest concern was whether she had enough flour for tomorrow's baking. When she opened her eyes, she found Michael watching her with a mixture of hope and resignation, as if he already knew what her answer would be but couldn't help hoping he was wrong. "Michael," she said gently, "you belong to the world. You belong to every person who voted for you, every community that needs your voice, every cause that requires your influence. If you tried to belong only to me, you would lose the very qualities that make me care for you." His hands tightened on hers. "And you?" "I belong to this land," Joanna continued, her voice growing stronger with certainty. "I belong to this quiet, to this simple life I built from nothing. I belong to the freedom to speak my mind without calculating political costs, and to the satisfaction of feeding people well without ulterior motives." She paused, studying his face in the dim light that filtered through the restaurant windows. "If we forced this connection," she said softly, "if we tried to merge our worlds, we would both lose what makes us ourselves. You would resent the smallness of my world, and I would suffocate in the complexity of yours." Michael nodded slowly, and she could see that he understood, even as his heart rebelled against the logic of her words. "But if circumstances were different?" he asked, echoing his hypothetical question from their morning conversation. "If circumstances were different," Joanna replied, "we might have had something beautiful. But circumstances are what they are, and wisdom lies in accepting what cannot be changed." Michael lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was both a greeting and a farewell, an acknowledgement of what might have been and an acceptance of what could never be. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For reminding me who I wanted to be. For showing me that integrity isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. For proving that there are still people in this world who choose truth over advantage." Michael released her hands and stepped back, putting physical distance between them to match the emotional space that duty and wisdom demanded. "Will I see you again?" he asked, echoing his question from the morning. "Perhaps," Joanna said with a small smile. "Politicians do need to eat, after all. And if you're ever passing through Willowbrook as a man who's honestly hungry for both food and truth, there will always be room at table 6. Michael Redford walked out into the desert night, carrying with him the memory of candlelight and honest conversation, of a woman who had chosen peace over prestige, and had helped him understand the difference between compromise and surrender. The stars above were brilliant in the clear outback sky, ancient lights that had watched over countless stories of love found and love lost, of dreams pursued and wisdom accepted. Behind him, Joanna Mallory began the familiar ritual of closing her restaurant, but her movements were slower than usual, more thoughtful. When she finally extinguished the last lamp and locked the door behind her, she stood for a moment on the front porch, breathing in the cool night that carried the scent of eucalyptus and the promise of another day in the life she had chosen. As she walked toward her small house behind the restaurant, she was humming again, not the love song from her youth this time, but something new, something that spoke of contentment rather than longing, of choices made with both heart and head engaged. In the morning, there would be bread to bake and meals to prepare, townspeople to feed and conversations to be had. There would be the simple satisfaction of work well done and the quiet pride of a life lived on her own terms. And sometimes, when the light was just right and the desert wind carried whispers of distant places, she would remember a man with storm-gray eyes who had asked her to share his world, and she would smile at the memory of having been brave enough to say no. Sometimes, the most powerful love stories are the ones that don't end with happily ever after, but with freedom, wisdom, and peace. If Joanna's story moved you, subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts below. Have you ever chosen solitude over someone who couldn't stay?